Pearson, the host of Decisions Now, which is a podcast brought to you by Evalueserve about how to leverage data and AI to improve business decisions. Today, we're joined by Aleksandar Ruzicic, who is the chairman and CEO of Alisman Healthcare and senior vice president of Stratton's Partners. With over a decade as a partner at Executive Insight, where he held leadership roles in operations and marketing, Aleks has dedicated his career to shaping the future of healthcare and life sciences, strategic consulting, and entrepreneurship. So, Aleks, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me, Erin.
Yeah, excited to have you here today. As we're seeing substantially right now, the healthcare industry is really evolving quite a bit with significant shifts in how value is being defined, measured, and delivered. So your experience leading commercial strategy and operations gives you a really nice perspective on successful market entry. So in this episode, we're going to explore how healthcare companies can navigate these challenges and prepare for a future that is increasingly influenced by data science and AI. So just to jump right in, many healthcare companies are struggling to translate their innovations into successful market entries. You've championed applying value-based healthcare principles directly into R&D processes throughout your career. So can you share some examples of how this approach has changed outcomes for organizations that you've worked with?
Yes, certainly. So let's first start with the definition of value-based healthcare. It came out actually in a paper that was published by Michael Porter and Elizabeth Teisberg around June 2024 in Harvard Business Review. And they really kind of looked at the value defined as incremental patient-relevant outcomes over the incremental total healthcare costs. And when we look at this in projects, we found this to be valid not just in Europe, as you could imagine, where it certainly holds true, but also in the US. There is one example I can share with you of concrete projects in the US. It was related to a situation related to a follow-on indication, a severe dermatology indication that had a very severe quality of life issue. The lead indication was in immunology with a mortality issue. And the assumption that we had on pricing at the start of the project was that it was a 6-digit figure due to higher dosing compared to the lead indication. And the question that came up after phase 2 failed to show meaningful outcomes, what to do next. And the client then said, well, let's figure out together with the US affiliate what to do together with the global. If we can't make it work in the US, then it might not work anywhere else. And so we really kind of went into the situation and tried to understand what could be done. And we realized quickly that even if the drug were approved in a rare disease indication with a proper label, payers wouldn't really kind of provide the drugs to their patients. They would be step edits of hell with other off-label immunology drugs. And particularly because of the high price, and these off-label immunology drugs were in the range of 5-digit figures per year. And so we actually kind of recommended to discontinue this particular follow-on indication, assuming there is a limited opportunity to stratify patients for efficacy. Then the second example is a more kind of generic example from the US, rare disease with high unmet need in nephrology. There was a standard of care with a high-dose systemic corticosteroid, leading to high mortality. So the question here was really, what are the patient subpopulations? What are meaningful endpoints? What are price ranges that could come up with in Europe across a couple of markets? And the conclusion was really that patients that are not recommended steroid therapy, they needed to kind of be treated. For example, those with diabetes or severe osteoporosis. And the outcomes that we had to look into after the project were related to organ damage, safety, remission rates, remission length as well, and then quality of life and long-term mortality. So clearly in both projects, the focus on value-based healthcare led to concrete decisions in the R&D.
Yeah. It's interesting when we talk about value based. It's when you talk about healthcare, of course, you have a very different perspective because the value has a lot to do with somebody's individual health, which is far more personal than in a more traditional, like a B2B environment, which it tends to be a value for just a company overall. So it is interesting all the considerations that go into all of this. Now, your research in the US market has quantitatively examined the link between demonstrating value and achieving commercial success. So, what surprising insights have you uncovered about this relationship that might challenge the conventional thinking throughout the industry?
Yeah, so we looked at four different scenarios: early development, where we looked into heterogeneous modalities, for example, for one rare disease indication called spinal muscular atrophy. Then we looked at proof of concept stage, where we looked at the indication sequence for pipeline in a drug type products. And then at the pivotal trial stage, we looked into fast followers and differentiation, a gold standard. There we looked into obesity, and then at the franchise level, we looked into comparison to drugs that are on the market, for example, with new endpoints. And if I take the examples, we always looked at outcomes, at the price relative to each other, and then also at topics like capability related to outcomes as well, comfort that often relate to administration, and then calm, like peace of mind. Does it really work? Do I have the coverage? Do I have any question marks that could kind of come up as a patient during the treatment? And when we looked at the example one here, the topic around early development at the time of 2015, when kind of we looked into this, it was still a significant unmet need for new therapies. There was a later entry therapy focused on capability with a lot more motor functions for 8, 12, 24 months, comfort with an oral therapy, and calm also because of continuous coverage with a reasonable price. And therefore, the competitive edge was really on patient relevant outcomes. And then also at the launch afterwards, with some significantly lower cost for infants and also kind of comparable cost to adults. So clearly, all of that then led to the oral therapy that came last on market to grab more and more market share also in the US.
Yeah.
And then in the second example of obesity, we looked at how the obesity market developed and the GLP-1s and then also the follow-on compounds, etc. They really made a big difference once the 15% weight loss or more of 15% weight loss was achieved. And then, of course, also there were some other outcomes that had to be demonstrated, like cardiovascular events reduction. And but what was surprising is that also for the US, there were some head-to-head comparative trials done against future standard of care or current standard of care. And that actually then led also to some disappointments for some of the companies because these phase 3 trials occasionally also failed. And what was also surprising is that the second entry actually did compete also on price against the first entry that made 15% plus weight loss. And one could explain this as particularly sensitive market with a lot of out-of-pocket contribution, and the price difference was around 20%. So even in the US, there was a competition on price, despite being actually to a certain degree more efficacious than the in-market drug already.
Yeah. Oh, that's quite interesting. And one of the things that we're seeing is when we're going into new markets, the stakeholder landscape is more and more complex. We're not just looking at physicians and payers. So, how are patient voices, kind of like you've described in these different examples, and regulatory considerations reshaping the launch strategies? And would you have any recommendations on adjustments that companies can make to address these new influencers?
Yeah, so I think regulators and physicians or the hospitals that the physicians work in and payers have already been taken care of for quite a while. And now I think patients have actually a voice at the table together with their caregivers, particularly in orphan drugs, or parents, in many different ways. So they can actually contribute to regulatory decisions. They can contribute to access, market access, and pricing decisions. They can sometimes also contribute to demand availability decisions in particular countries. And they are now involved clearly in clinical trial design. What are meaningful outcomes for patients? What are quality of life measurements? What are the various kind of patient related outcomes that can be reported by them? And what we also see is that they actually can be more involved in monitoring their own diseases and symptoms. So there is, for example, there are some apps that allow patients to monitor multiple sclerosis. And this is for active tests daily or weekly. There is a pinch test. There are a shape test, a walk test, a balance test, a cognitive test, etc. And all of that allows actually MS patients to understand if they're really under control or if the current treatment potentially lacks some of the efficacy, and they would be ready for potentially an alternative treatment that handles their condition better. And then in Europe, if we look at in Europe particularly, where we have been involved in some of these projects as well, there are formal committees where patients are involved. For example, the joint HTA assessment, where comparators and outcomes and endpoints are discussed. And as we said before, the patient-reported outcomes measures or PROMs. Then there are also other committees where patients are involved, like the Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use, Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee, Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products, etc.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting to see how, of course, technology and, just being more aware of what's going on is really changing how the commercial access is being defined within healthcare companies as well. And one of the things that we're also seeing is that healthcare markets can vary quite a bit in their readiness for innovation. So what frameworks have you developed to help companies assess and prepare for these differences across geographies, and how does this change their go-to-market approach?
So we look typically at market readiness, and can I give an example of a recent publication that we just submitted to Pharmaceutical Market Europe on antimicrobial resistance? And there we look at that situation today and the future state, what would be the ideal stage, and then we look at the different descriptions. So I give an example, like for example, for infections management, healthcare funding should support actually antimicrobial stewardship. So if you don't do that, then of course there is limited incentives for hospitals to follow antimicrobial stewardship. Or the antibiotics use should be limited to necessary cases and tailored to bacterial pathogens. Again, if that is not followed through, then that's a major issue. And then the innovation should also kind of be combining regulatory and market access frameworks to include public health considerations, like, for example, having available drugs that really work in the case of it. Then when we work on launch excellence projects, we also have a launch readiness framework that relates to this topic of market readiness. We kind of call this shape the market or prepare the market is one of three aspects. And there we also address environmental transformation, like the policy changes for infectious disease control, or KOL, like expert engagement, like the antimicrobial stewardship programs that need to be done at the country level. Then patient activation, that typically can involve guidelines and protocols. And then, of course, the payers that require special incentives. And ideally, in this case, actually, volume decoupled insurance approaches that exist also, for example, in the UK already. And then the treatment centers that need to do the proper procurement hospital by hospital, that still needs to be implemented.
Yeah. And if we move from strategic planning to operational execution, we oftentimes see this as a challenge within healthcare. So based on your experience building and scaling different healthcare businesses, what are the main bridges companies must build between these two domains to ensure a successful implementation?
So we see actually in the projects that strategy starts at the global level, and somehow operational execution is really done at the local level. And where are really kind of the potential barriers when we look at it, it's around assumptions. There might be a lot of focus on the best case that can include a bit of wishful thinking sometimes. So clearly, that is one key area where one needs to be careful, and where kind of local implementation might fail because the original assumptions just were not kind of holding in place. Then another kind of opportunity is about clarity of the strategy. I've been in kind of on projects where we worked on hemophilia, so rare disease, and client had actually multiple assets in hemophilia, including competing products for the same patients, for the same healthcare professionals, for the same hospitals. But no clear co-positioning between the new entry product and the already existing products in the market. And what happened is that this, of course, came up during the launch when somehow the countries and then the sales reps had to figure out. And what we also said to the client, well, if your countries don't do the job and your sales reps don't do the job, ultimately your competitors will actually co-position you, which is potentially not something you want to end up in. And that's what we then try to rectify. And then there are, of course, also tools. We talked about dermatology before, and there are countries where that can actually implement tools very quickly. For example, for diagnosis in dermatology, and also based on their own technology stack. So we had a project where diagnostics was actually one key area, or diagnosis was one key area, and we kind of started discussing with a pilot country like China how they would like to address this. And instead of talking, they really built the tool themselves very quickly and were ready for the launch. Mm-hmm. Then ultimately, there are sometimes some frameworks at the global level that can help countries to understand what to do around services, for example, experience design. It exists a lot in other industries, but might be in pharma, it can be applied more often. And then the question is more about local deliveries. And there, sometimes regulations are actually different country by country, and you cannot really standardize solutions. So, for example, home infusion, home delivery type of solutions really need to be done at the local level. Finally, I think one of the key areas we looked into always is what gets measured gets done. We look at key performance indicators, or KPIs. We try to measure early on, 2 years ahead of launch, the baseline that, for example, in a rare disease launch, that was typically done. Then until the launch, there is a lot of focus on disease understanding at the launch. Of course, treatment comes into play. And then we try to understand the different levels of indicators around results, which are ultimately the prescriptions, and they are typically kind of lagging. So you know 6 months into the launch if you have a good trajectory or not, but that's a bit late. So you also need leading indicators, for example, surveys with prescribers about their understanding and the key pain points, or you could also have hospital listing once you are in the launch. And then, of course, you can also include activity indicators if you like any other meaningful results driven and leading indicators, for example, number of engagements, etc.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. It's quite interesting to see the difference of, strategically you start on the global level, and then operationally it's much more regional, as you mentioned, and all of that. And, we've been talking to some other people that have also been describing similar things and how they're having to adjust go-to-market approaches based on all the regions having different requirements as well. But to the last piece on what you said in particular, there's a lot that goes into measurement capabilities. So from your perspective, what are the leading organizations doing to effectively capture and communicate their value proposition across the different stakeholder groups throughout the market entry process?
So when we look at this, we really look at 3 different things: evidence generation, then the agreements that actually capture the value, and then, of course, what is kind of done at the patient level for the value. And what we see a lot is that the aggregate level kind of evidence generation is really the easiest way forward. And there are two scenarios that are particularly simple, or not easy, but let's say kind of more straightforward than others. where you come in at least at the same outcome but at a lower cost. And we have seen this before. It actually, when you have this, for example, in spinal muscular atrophy, that really helps you a lot to come even late into the market with an oral and really capture more patient share. Or you can be better at the same cost, which or slightly lower cost, which we also have seen before in the obesity market. And sometimes you can also show that you're better with a comparator and still come in at a similar cost and then capture really more of the market. Now, if you don't have these type of data, then you need to generate it. And then the question is, how do you do that the easiest? So there are, of course, registries. So in the hemophilia example that I've shared before, we have come across a long-term outcome database where patients have been monitored, particularly on the impact of prophylaxis and what that does on the bleeds of the patients. And then, of course, there are other examples on real-world evidence post-approval. For example, in some countries, gene therapies had to kind of provide more real-world evidence after approval, showing more data on the efficacy. And then, of course, there is the individual level evidence that needs to be generated. Historically, there have been some cases. I think one of the first ones I've come across is in osteoporosis, where I worked many, many years ago, where a company paid for bone fractures the costs back to the insurer if that happened. It was quite a costly exercise also to kind of cover the costs, but ultimately these pay for performance deals are now less popular simply because they are an extra burden on creating the evidence.
And one of the things that we also see is healthcare innovations struggle to achieve a sustainable adoption despite some initial enthusiasm. So, what patterns have you observed in launches that maintain momentum versus those that die down after that initial entry?
So, one of the key important steps is really to have a cascade from global all the way to subnational, local level. So I give an example in rare diseases. We have actually worked with a company where we said the treatment centers are really a handful in each country, but we still want to make sure that we have a proper cascade to go through and to orchestrate that. So we defined global centers that we want to address globally already during the development. Then, of course, there are regional, let's say European and other type of continents approaches. You can also have the national centers and then subnational, and you roll that out step by step. And you really understand when, at what point in time, you start engaging the next layer, also involving, of course, the previous layers in that. And that clear strategy then allows you to understand also how patients are included in the various steps, either during the R&D all the way then to the launch afterwards. Then I think the other part of the adoption is really having a clear strategy, as we said before, with a clear and accepted patient stratification, also already during drug development. And then, of course, you need to move from the early KOLs all the way to the main treaters. Sometimes when we do primary market research, we do realize that KOLs have a different opinion from kind of the specialists that mostly focus on treating patients. And then I think another area that is crucial for success of launches is problem solving. You're kind of seeing an issue, an obstacle, and you try to understand why that is. There might be an insight in this, and then you try to find a way. So I give an example in ophthalmology. We saw that prescribers, ophthalmologists didn't prescribe. We tried to understand why that is, and it came up that they have a flat quarterly lump sum per patient in a particular country. And then we said, well, probably they cannot keep the patients and get the prescriptions done. So we would like to have an approach where they refer the patients to a specialist that is not having the same restrictions. And we called this the last chance for honor because their patients really needed the prescriptions. And for monetary reasons, that was not done. So there was an opportunity for the sales reps to try to engage with the ophthalmologists and find ways to have the best treatment for the patients. And then ultimately, there is also one question on speed of the launch. And I think we came back to the pricing question before. So if you price as much as high as possible, might be you're kind of slowing down adoption. But if you price at par or you price even at a certain level of lower than what is the current standard of care, like 10 to 20%, as with the previous examples, that can add a lot of speed in momentum during the uptake. And we have seen this in many different areas, from rare diseases and SMA, as discussed before, all the way to broad indications like obesity.
I really like the point around especially understanding what's the difference or the potential difference in opinion between the key opinion leaders, the KOLs, versus the physicians or the ones that are actually prescribing it, because that can make a huge difference in the success. So understanding the different audiences that you have and making sure that you get those opinions preemptively instead of as a reaction after it's on the market. So healthcare oftentimes moves a bit more cautiously compared to other sectors when adopting new commercial approaches. So what lessons from your work across different industries might help healthcare organizations become more agile in their market entry strategies while maintaining those necessary standards that healthcare demands?
So one of the areas that I work with is in services, and I think there, if I learn actually from medtech area, there is clearly a need to understand when innovations might not be sufficient anymore, and where you actually need to provide additional value to fetch a premium. I was actually told literally by a medtech company. I asked them, so they were German, having kind of a German engineering culture. And I asked them, so how do they come into service? And said, well, our engineers told us a decade ago that we cannot fetch a premium. And that's when they decided with the surgical instruments to go into additional services like sharpening and sterilization solutions and so on. And you can see this actually in many other industries, that sometimes innovation per se is not sufficient, and actually what is a product business turns into a services business. And this is particularly true if healthcare also changes. And we will potentially discuss about healthcare changing also afterwards when we talk about AI and data sciences. And then the other topic that I kind of also work in is key account management. And there it was very interesting. We worked for a generics company, and so there you wouldn't think there is a lot of value that the generics company can provide, but we still kind of tried to implement the key account management approach. And one of the key kind of differences in the approach was that we tried to unlock the potential with executive meetings. And these executive meetings led actually to very interesting opportunities. So in one meeting with one country, the country said that they have a particular issue with low volume stocks that run out of stock, and therefore they wanted to make sure that they had adequate coverage of that. And then, of course, the generic company said, yes, we can do this, but it would require a premium, in which the answer was yes, but then make it multi-year, because we would like to ensure that we don't run into the problem next year again. And so there was a win-win for both companies. And it just shows that when you work directly with the executives of healthcare accounts, that you can actually find out what they need. And you can imagine that this is true even more so during launches. And then the other area that I work on is with Stratton's partners, where we work on in-market products. And there we actually see that other sectors are much more pressured to do the best out of what they have. And there we worked in the past with GE, with Lego, Michelin, McDonald's, and they are much more advanced actually with digital tools, automation, and understanding how to use this best.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, and especially on aligning with executives, it also gets you to the outcomes faster, what the company is really looking for. So that's a very key step there. So just Aleks, my last question for you, looking towards the future, how are emerging technologies like AI and advanced data science changing our understanding of value in healthcare, and how should companies begin to prepare for their commercial strategies given these shifts?
So I would differentiate two aspects here. One is the own from a pharma company perspective, what do we need to do? And then of course, what is the more strategic impact because healthcare is changing. And that's potentially the more interesting one. So if I look at healthcare systems and countries' differences, we have examples actually of some more recent ones. For example, in Israel, kind of was very key to during the COVID-19 trials when they provided Pfizer BioNTech with anonymized epidemiological data, and they were really able to do this because of the data systems and data science systems they have in place with their insurers. And then, of course, what we talked before about is dermatology. And China is an example. The reason that company was able to do a dermatology solution was also because, in general, there were much more advanced diagnosis tools in China already applied that overcame some of the limitations, like not having enough dermatologists, trained dermatologists for the large population. Then, when we come to internal own kind of AI data sciences, and I think we talked before about the example of multiple sclerosis, where you can actually have apps with that can be used by patients, for example, to overcome certain issues patients have, like this not understanding if they're well controlled and that the treatment works well with the active tests. Or you can also have services that provide information. For example, precision oncology requires good diagnostic tests and around genomic mutations that are driving cancer. And for example, Foundation Medicine, that was acquired by Roche, provides these tests and now has over 1.3 million reports delivered by Foundation Medicine. And I was told actually by a medical science liaison that they can get kind of questions on individual patients and what to do actually in a particular patient because of the unique database that they have in that case. Of course, without naming the patient, but more kind of profile the genomic result. And ultimately, I think the key question is also what will AI data sciences do for healthcare? And we could see actually a leapfrogging in low and middle income countries where some of the issues that they have, like not having enough infrastructure, not having enough trained personnel, they could overcome this. And we have seen historic examples like the M-Pesa mobile money system in Kenya that was in place since 2007. And people actually wouldn't know this until they came to the countries and then started using it so early in the process.
Yeah. Well, Aleks, that was a great overview. I think there's a lot that's coming, of course, and a lot that's changing. But I really appreciate you joining us today, and especially all the examples that you gave throughout. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Erin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Decisions Now. Check out all episodes at evalueserve.com/podcast, and don't forget to subscribe for future episodes.